Our story begins in a forest, the ancient Forest of Arden, that long ago covered the area we know as Solihull. The forest may have been a hunting ground for prehistoric man, but the earliest evidence of habitation in the region is at Berrymound Camp, which lies across fields adjacent to Poplar Road in Solihull Lodge. It is thought to have been occupied by ancient Britons in the Celtic period, which began around 500 BC. Part of the moat and earthen ramparts are still visible. The first step towards the creation of modern Solihull came after the Roman legions departed. They had occupied Britain since 55 BC, but had little or no impact on the immediate Solihull area, which was protected by the dense forest. In about 450 AD, Anglo-Saxon invaders sailed across the North Sea from northern Germany. They comprised of smallish groups, each with its own leader. One of these groups penetrated deep into the Forest of Arden, searching for a less dense area in which to settle. They chose a site on a long hill and set about creating a clearing, using the trees to build their homes. The settlement became known as Langdone, or Longdon, which literally means long hill. A ride down Hampton Lane in Solihull will take you up the shoulder of the long hill and along its crest, which was once the site of that Anglo-Saxon camp. The dwellings had changed a little. And they would not have had the luxury of electric street lighting. But if you turn off Hampton Lane into Ravenshaw Lane, you will come to the River Blythe, an all-important source of water to the settlers. This scene is probably very similar to the one that greeted those ancient pioneers. Another group settled a few miles away at Hobbs Moat, near to the junction with Castle Lane. This settlement became known as Olverley, or Wolverley, which some say translates to Wolfhere's Clearing, after the leader of the group, Wolfhere. The name Olverley is preserved in local street names, such as Olverley Green Road. Although the oak trees have long since reclaimed the site, the Saxon fortifications can still be seen. They dug a moat up to 20 feet deep and 90 feet wide and spread the earth over the enclosure to create a raised platform on which they built their homes. They also cleared areas of forest outside the settlement for cultivation. By 700 AD, after a lot of fierce fighting, the Anglo-Saxons controlled virtually the whole country. The Britons had fled to Wales, Cornwall and Scotland. The Welsh people today keep alive the language of those ancient Britons, and it is interesting to note that the name Wales comes from the word welas, the Anglo-Saxon word for foreigners. The land controlled by the Anglo-Saxons became known as Angleland. The two settlements of Olverley and Langdone would eventually give birth to Solihull. It was not long before another invasion. This time it was the turn of the Vikings. The invasion began as plunder raids in about 750 AD and turned into conquest and settlement. Their influence was mainly in the northern half of England. They had little permanent effect on the Solihull area. However, the years of fighting in the north had left England weakened. Yet another invasion, this time from the Normans, led by William the Conqueror, culminated in the defeat of the Saxon king, Harold, at Hastings in 1066. The creation of Solihull was another step nearer. William divided the land amongst his followers, most of whom had come with him from Normandy on the promise of such reward. It is strange, therefore, that at the time of the Domesday Survey in 1086, the manors of Overley and Langdone were still in English hands. The Domesday Book shows that Langdone was held by a man called Turchill, with Almar as his tenant, and Overley by Christina. Christina was the sister of Edgar Etheling, who was the last male of the Saxon royal family, and related to the defeated King Harold. Overley passed to the Limesey family from Normandy when Christina became a nun. Information from a Domesday map shows the area as one of the most sparsely populated in the country, still mainly dominated by the Forest of Arden. You may recognise some other names on the map. Following the Norman conquest, trade in England began to grow, with markets springing up around the country. The lord of the manor hosting the market benefited in the form of tolls and fines. The Limeses wanted a piece of the action. In about 1180 AD, they chose a site for a trading centre inside the manor of Overley, but close enough to Langdone to attract business from there. It was also close to the main route from Birmingham to Warwick. They called the site Solihull. Solihull, meaning Pigsty Hill or Dirty Hill, probably began life as a clearing in the forest, where the scattered population would meet to trade. 20 years later, a village had begun to take shape, and in 1220 AD, St Alfred's Church was founded. By 1242, trade was brisk enough for the lord of the manor, by then William Oddingsell, whose father had married into the Limesey family, to purchase a charter to hold a weekly market and an annual 3-day fair. Solihull was thriving. Then came a setback. By the early 1300s, the local branch of the Oddingsell family had died out, and with no resident lord of the manor to promote trade, things began to slow down. Although the market probably continued in some form, Solihull settled into rural village life. It was overshadowed by its rival Birmingham, and away from the mainstream of English life. It seems likely that the seat of the lord of the manor, until the death of the Oddingsells, remained at the original Saxon site at Hobbs Moat. The name Hobbs Moat is derived from Oddingsales Moat, which became corrupted to Hoggingsales Moat. By the 1600s, this had been shortened to Hog's Moat, which became Hobbs Moat. With the end of the Oddingsales, the seat of local power shifted to Solihull. Ulverley became known as the Old Town, later shortened to Olton. By the mid-1800s, Solihull was little more than a village surrounded by farms and small hamlets, with the remaining land occupied by the forest. Some of the farms, like Shelley Farm, now a housing estate, were shown in records as early as the 12th century. This view from Homer Road looks across fields to the village. This is now the site of the new council house and civic hall. In 1852, something happened that was to transform Solihull forever. The station opened, providing easy access to the by now thriving industrial town of Birmingham. Wealthy Birmingham industrialists and merchants saw Solihull with its clean air and open spaces as the ideal place to live, away from the noise and grime. By the late 1800s, large houses were appearing, both within and on the edge of the village. New roads like Homer Road and Herbert Road, two of the earliest, cut across fields between the village and the station. Despite the concern of old Silhillians, the development continued, changing the face of the town centre. This is the High Street, looking from Station Road in 1850. The Georgian farmhouse belonged to the Homer family. The double-gabled building next door was demolished in 1880. This is where Barclays Bank now stands. This is Harborne House on the High Street in 1870. In front is Jimmy Crump, the water carrier, who fetched water from a spring at Street's Brook and sold it to locals who didn't want to use the village pump. The High Street in 1897, with St Alphege in the background. On the right is Alcock's Emporium. The building is recognisable today and is still used as shops. A similar view in 1902. The Mason's Arms is on the left. Alcock's Emporium was still there. "50 years later, the village had become a bustling town. Next to Joseph Harris the Cleaner's is Mill Lane, which now forms one side of Mell Square. As you can see, by the 1950s, parking had become a problem, and in those days cars had access to Mill Lane. These houses in Mill Lane were demolished to make way for shops. On the opposite side of the High Street to Mill Lane, 2 doors away from Napier and Sons, is the Manor House, which still stands on the High Street. The Manor House is a fine example of 16th century architecture. It was built in 1545 by the Greswold family and had various owners through the following centuries until 1936, when it was bought by Ansells, with the intention of turning it into a country-style hotel. The scheme hit problems. Then war broke out. By 1945, the manor house had fallen into disrepair, and Ansells decided to sell it for commercial development. Local people protested, and Ansells agreed to hold up the sale to give them time to raise the £12,000 required to save the old house. After much effort coordinated by Miss Forster of Morven School, the sum was raised, and the house was bought by the Manor House Charity Trust, who still own and maintain it today. It survives on donations and by hiring out rooms in the house for functions and meetings. An interesting note from an article in the now defunct Austin magazine in 1945, lending support to the Silhillians campaign, refers to the local pronunciation of Solihull as being Silul. This is the High Street in the 60s, looking towards Station Road. The High Street today, with St Alphege still keeping an eye on proceedings. In 1910, Touchwood Hall stood in Drury Lane. This is Drury Lane prior to the Mell Square development. Which turned it into this. The George Hotel has stood in the square for many years. This was taken in about 1890. It looks as though these folk may have enjoyed a few drinks there. In those days, there was no fear of being breathalyzed on the way home. In 1940, the George is still there, but the mode of transport has changed somewhat, and a memorial has been erected to Silhillians who sadly died in the First World War. In Solihull town centre, you are never far from a pub, and that was true even before the great changes the 20th century has brought. Here is the Sadler's Arms in 1890, with the Barley Mow in the background, at the junction with Poplar Road and Warwick Road. By the early 1900s, the barley mow has undergone a transformation. A doctor's house stood opposite on the Warwick Road. Further along the Warwick Road is the Golden Lion. The landlord in 1890 was Mr. Edgington, seen here with his family. The malt shovel on the High Street later became the Snooty Fox. Poplar Road has undergone major change since this view in 1913, looking towards Warwick Road. By 1940, it was totally different. Poplar Road again. The buildings from left to right are the Council House, Lloyd's Bank and the police station. The changes began to affect the outskirts of the village. This is unrecognisable now as Blossomfield Road. As Solihull expanded and the demand for housing increased, areas like Shirley were developed in the 1920s to meet the need. Before the development, Shirley was little more than a hamlet, known since 1332 as Shirley Street, surrounded by fields. The urbanisation enveloped Shirley Street and Haslock's Green. Scenes like these at Haslock's Green by the 1930s had disappeared. This is Haslock's Green Road after development. This view, coming from the Stratford Road direction, is very similar to today's, apart from the volume of traffic. Here is the drawbridge at the canal in Shirley. This young couple were presumably enjoying a Sunday outing. Dare's Stores is in the background. This is a section of the Stratford Road in Shirley in 1910. The Stratford Road in 1920. Try parking there today. On the opposite side of the road are some shops that probably only the older members of the community will remember. Here is Archer's Garage on the Stratford Road in 1930. Then it was also a cafe, maybe a forerunner of the motorway services. Olton was another area which, like Shirley, underwent dramatic change in the 1920s. This is Beeches Lane, near Olton, in 1907. It later became Gospel Lane. The Warwick Road in 1920. This is the junction of the old and new Warwick Road. This is the old Warwick Road. And the new Warwick Road. You can just about make out the horse and cart coming down the hill. Olton Hall in 1920. It later became a pub. These are the shops at Olton Hollow, early 1900s. Elmdon is another area that has seen much development. It is also the home of the Land Rover factory. The factory was built during the Second World War as a shadow factory to build aircraft. It remains one of the largest single employers in the region. In 1974, Solihull became a metropolitan borough. Its boundaries were extended, taking in small surrounding villages and some urban areas like Marston Green and Chelmsley Wood. Situated in the north of the borough, Marston Green has seen the change from village to residential area. This is the old gravel pit, with St Leonard's behind. Here is Marston Green Tavern in about 1917. Chelmsley Wood is a housing development built by Birmingham Council in 1966, but in the boundary changes of 1974 became part of the new Solihull borough. The land on which it stands was held in 1130 by Geoffrey de Clinton. It is recorded that in 1200 AD, Margaret de Clinton was given the wood called Chelmsey. Meriden, in the northeast corner of the borough, claims to be the centre of England. This is the old Queen's Head pub, pre-1914, taking a delivery of ale. The main road in Meriden, when it was common for motor vehicles and horses to share the roads. Obviously, these gardens were not short of manure. The position of this van on the wrong side of the road suggests that there was little traffic about in those days. Bicken Hill is a small village near to the National Exhibition Centre. Its church is the earliest example of Norman architecture in the region. Hampton-in-Arden is the setting for Shakespeare's As You Like It. It has a number of well-preserved 17th century houses. This is the village and post office in 1905. This old view of the High Street has changed little. The village stores is still there, serving the local community. Berskwell is another delightful village. Here is an old view of the crossroads. The well that gave Berskwell its name is near to the church and is said to have been used for baptisms. This was taken in the early 1900s. And this is what it looks like today, virtually unchanged. Temple Berskwell, with its 13th century red sandstone church, gets its name from the Knights Templar. The Templars were an organisation of soldiers who also took vows of poverty and chastity, and lived the lives of monks when not at war. Berskwell was a gift to the Templars by Roger de Mowbray around 1146, and became known as Temple Berskwell. The almshouses were left to trustees by Lady Catherine Levison in 1674 to house 20 poor widows from Berskwell. The village of Knowle, although it has seen much residential development in recent years, has retained some of its charm. A number of the buildings on the High Street date from the 15th century. This is the High Street in 1907. Although it has seen some changes, those of you who know Knowle will recognise some of these views. Knowle High Street today provides a reminder that change is an ongoing process. In the background is an old timbered building, and in the foreground is a conventional red telephone box. In between, a high-tech phone kiosk has appeared, and it doesn't even take money. Whatever next? Adjoining Knowle is Dorridge, just a hamlet until the station opened in 1878. This is Station Approach, opposite the Forest Hotel. This parade took place in Dorridge in 1919, the year after the end of the First World War. Notice the gentleman in uniform, obviously glad to have returned home safely. We return to Solihull town centre, still called the village by many local people. As we have seen, in a little over 1500 years, Solihull has gone from a Saxon settlement to a medieval market to a village, from a village to a town, and from a town to a borough. And the changes inevitably will continue. But we'll end our story where it began, back in the forest. A ride around the region today reveals the remnants of the once great Forest of Arden that long ago dominated the area that is now Solihull.